AP 120, Chapter 7, Bone Growth, Calcium, Homeostasis, and Bone Fractures. So, our bones initially started to develop when we were fetuses. And the bones were produced through two main processes that were similar but distinct. Intramembranous bone formation, primarily in the skull, flat bones of the skull, and endochondral bones, which is all the rest of the bones of the body. And in both cases, some other type of connective tissue gets replaced with bone tissue. So we'll start with intramembranous bone formation. Well, initially we had this big sheet of connective tissue, embryonic connective tissue, and in locations scattered throughout that big sheet of connective tissue, ossification centers would form. So little areas where bone tissue would begin to form, scattered all throughout. And so first what would happen is osteoblasts would be produced, and then the osteoblasts would begin to form the bone's extracellular matrix and spread out, and that extra material would then become calcified, become bone tissue. And of course, there will be some osteoblasts trapped within the bone tissue that then become osteocytes. And then these isolated regions of growing bone tissue would meet up. And when they meet up, they would end up forming basically what looks like spongy bone tissue. With, again, the osteocytes inside the lacuna, the osteoblasts on the outside. Blood vessels would begin to incorporate with this bone tissue. Nerves would begin to incorporate. And then eventually, through bone remodeling, we would end up with the shape of flat bones that we would expect, with compact bone tissue toward the surface and sandwiched in between spongy bone tissue, and of course lots of blood vessels and nerves. And then eventually the periosteum would also form on the outside. So that is how the intramembranous bones, the flat bones of the skull, were produced. And again, only in the bones, flat bones of the skull. And of course, this process doesn't complete until after the infant is born. And that's why there's a soft spot on the top of babies' heads. All right, then we have how endochondral bones were formed. Now, this is for all the rest of the bones of the body. They start off initially as a cartilaginous model, a piece of hyaline cartilage, the approximate shape in the approximately correct location. And so we start off with a cartilage skeleton, as it were. Then, in a similar process, we will have osteoblasts begin to develop in the center of the bones, and the osteoblasts build up the bone tissue that then becomes calcified, and then, of course, osteoblasts trapped in the bone tissue will become osteocytes, and this developing bone tissue will continue to grow and replace the cartilage. And then we'll have a development of the primary ossification center, primarily in the diaphysis of long bones. And then, of course, bone remodeling will occur, and we'll get the spongy bone internally, the compact bone on the outside, blood vessels being incorporated, a medullary cavity forming. Then we would get secondary ossification centers developing in the epiphyses on either ends. And this again will start off with osteoblasts that will produce the organic bone material that becomes calcified, and it'll spread and so on. And then this process continues in the infant. And then eventually in the very young child, we will get the structures associated with the long bone, and also the epiphyseal plates, which is the remnants of that original hyaline cartilage model. And the epiphyseal plates are important because that's where bones grow in length. And then, of course, finally, when the child is no longer growing taller, the epiphyseal plates will be replaced with bone tissue and become the epiphyseal lines found in adults. but we'll always have a tiny bit of that hyaline cartilage remaining, the articular cartilage found at the smooth ends of the bones where they come together to form moving joints. All right, here is an x-ray of a child or adult's hand, one or the other. So tell me, looking at this image, is this a child or is it an adult? Well, it turns out this is the hand of a child. And we know this because here is like one of the finger bones, and then there's this space between pieces of bones. Here's one of the bones in the palm of the hand. Again, there's this empty space. Well, that space isn't empty. That's where the hyaline cartilage of the epiphyseal plate is. So what we're seeing here is the child's long bones with the epiphyseal plates that are less dense because they are not mineralized. This bones aren't broken, they're just what you expect in a child's hand. All right, bones grow in length and also in width. In length, they grow up at the epiphyseal plates. In width, they grow at the surface of the bone. And basically, the way this works is that we have all kinds of blood vessels lying on the surface of the bone. And then the osteoblasts will build up bone tissue that will go eventually all the way around the blood vessels, giving us a little tunnel lined with what is now endosteum and blood vessels found within that tunnel. And then the osteoblasts will continue to form bone tissue around that tunnel, forming concentric rings, those concentric layers of lamella, and giving us the osteon structure we expect to see in compact bone tissue. So bone width occurs at the periphery where the periosteum is. Osteoblasts will form tissue around blood vessels, and then the periosteum that's trapped inside will become endosteum, and the layers of bone will increase to give that osteon structure. Now, as the bones grow wider, they don't get significantly thicker. So as the bones grow in width on the outside surfaces, the bones lose bone tissue on the inside surfaces. And this is so that our bones don't get too thick, because if they're really, really thick, then there'd be a lot of weight that we'd have to move, and we'd all have to look a lot more bulky and have a lot more muscle tissue than we actually have. So through bone remodeling, we make sure that as the bones grow in width, they don't get too much thicker. A little bit, but not too much in terms of the bone tissue. Red bone marrow. Red bone marrow is found in spongy bone tissue, and it is where we produce all blood cells. Produce the red blood cells, the white blood cells, and the platelets through the process of hematopoiesis. And of course, red bone marrow is red because of the hemoglobin that is found in red blood cells. And hemoglobin is important because it binds oxygen. Calcium homeostasis. Calcium homeostasis, very important for maintaining proper calcium levels in the bloodstream. And we want this because so many functions in our body require calcium, including the function of neurons, including the functions of muscles, and many other things. So there's a set point. There's an ideal amount of calcium in our bloodstream. And should we end up with too much calcium in our bloodstream, this could lead to problems like an overactive heart. So we have receptors in the thyroid gland that can detect this increase in blood calcium levels. And this will cause the thyroid gland to secrete the hormone calcitonin. And calcitonin will enter the bloodstream, go find the osteoblasts, and stimulate the osteoblasts to produce more bone tissue. So as the osteoblasts build up the organic bone material, calcium is removed from the bloodstream to calcify and solidify that bone tissue, and this will lower blood calcium levels back to normal. Of course, we can also have the other problem. We could have too little calcium in the bloodstream. So again, calcium levels in the bloodstream go down. There are cells with receptors in the parathyroid glands. They detect these low levels of blood calcium. They then secrete the hormone parathyroid hormone. And parathyroid hormone will then find the osteoclasts and stimulate and activate the osteoclasts. Osteoclasts break down organic bone material, and this will release calcium into the bloodstream, returning calcium to its normal ideal levels. So what we see, we have this certain set point, this certain ideal level for calcium levels. When the calcium in the blood gets too high, thyroid gland releases calcitonin, activating the osteoblasts, removing calcium from the bloodstream. Then if this should overshoot and blood calcium levels get too low, then the parathyroid glands detect this, release the parathyroid hormone, stimulating the osteoclasts, which then again return our blood levels to that set ideal level of calcium. Good old negative feedback, keeping us healthy with an internal, stable environment. So if the blood calcium levels are not properly controlled, one thing that could happen is someone, usually a child, could develop rickets. Rickets is actually caused from a deficiency in vitamin D. The child does not have enough vitamin D. Vitamin D's function is to increase absorption of calcium via the small intestines. So if vitamin D levels are too low, the child cannot absorb enough calcium from the food they eat, and this can lead to weak bones. And these weak bones will end up bending, and so their leg bones, for instance, will grow sort of bent out, bow-legged. Body movements. All right, bones, as we know, are the rigid rods that muscles act on to cause movement to occur. So bones act as levers. The muscles, then when they contract, generate force, pulling on the bones, causing movement at joints. Joints could be thought of as the fulcrum. So joints are the fulcrum. Muscles generate the force or work, and bones act as the levers that allow for movement so that we can, say, lift something heavy. Again, we want to control movements in both directions. So there's opposite set of muscles that then will pull on bones to allow for the opposite kind of movement so that we can both lift things and lower things in controlled manners. Fractures. So we can get stress fractures that are microscopic or pathological fractures from, say, a bone infection. There is the green stick fractures. This is incomplete fracture, so partially broken and the bone bends. There's the fissured fracture that goes up the length of the bone but doesn't necessarily break it into pieces. There's the comminuted fracture where the impact is so severe that the bone shatters at that location, so you have many small pieces. There's the transverse fracture where it's a simple fracture going through the bone. These are the best kind if you're going to break your bone because they're easiest to heal. You can get an oblique fracture that's at an angle. And you can get a spiral fracture where the fracture spirals up along the length of the bone. This is a pretty difficult to heal fracture because if the bone shifts any, it messes up the alignment quite easily. Bone repair. So if you have a fracture, the first thing that happens is blood vessels are damaged, blood is released, leading to a hematoma. So the first thing that forms at a fracture is a blood hematoma, causing the swelling in that area. Then over time, over weeks, the blood hematoma gets replaced with a soft callus made of fibrocartilage. So that area gets replaced with fibrocartilage, blood vessels begin to regrow within that space. Then the soft callus is replaced with hard callus made up of spongy bone tissue, continuing the growth and repair of the bone in those areas. And then finally, at the end of the process, bone remodeling allows for the reformation of the expected structure with compact bone on the outside, spongy bone on the inside, and of course, in this case, the medullary cavity in the middle. Bone loss from aging, we lose minerals, we lose the ability to form the extracellular matrix. This can lead to brittleness of the bone, making it easy to break, which can lead to osteoporosis, which occurs more often in women. And here are some ways to prevent it: sunlight, vitamin D, lots of and exercise. That's it for this lecture.